Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
So Joe Biden stepped in it recently, not that that's anything new, but this time he might have inflamed his most important voters, his base, the people he needs to show up in big numbers supporting him on November 3rd. He said, as we played in the first segment, that if you have a problem figuring out whether you're for me or Trump, you ain't black. Almost as if he himself was black, which he most decidedly is not. Joining us to analyze whether this big dust-up was truly damaging to the presumptive Democratic presidential nominee or merely a tempest in a teapot sure to be ignored by the elite media is the man who schools us on the cross-section of culture and politics, LibertyNation.com socio-political correspondent, Mr. Jeff Charles. Welcome back, Jeff.
Hey, thanks for having me again.
It's a pleasure. Now, Jeff, if you're not voting for me over Trump, you ain't black. Half of me says Joe Biden made a huge mistake acting like he takes the black vote for granted. But the other half of me says he was just being what he said, a wise guy making a flippant remark. Which are you buying and why?
I'm buying both of those. See, but here's one thing where I'll push back on you a little bit. He said acting like he takes the black vote for granted. No, he's not acting. He does take the black vote for granted, which is what the Democrats have done for decades. And realistically, I mean, it's hard to blame them when they've had 90% of the black vote for decades.
Jeff, explain to me why Joe Biden seems to be so popular among black people. Is it just because he was Obama's vice president?
I think that's part of it, but I don't think that explains all of it. I think Biden presents a sense of familiarity, a sense of normalcy. On top of that, I mean, about 65% of black voters consider themselves to be moderate or conservative. So there's a very small percentage that are actually way to the far left. So when it comes to the field of Democratic nominees during the primaries, he's the one that they were going to gravitate to in the first place.
Now, Jeff, on one side, you have Biden's long support from the NAACP and his voting record on civil rights. On the other, you have his support for the infamous crime bill in the 1990s, which incarcerated an awful lot of black people.
He was one of the authors and champions of that bill, which had a devastating impact on the black community. It helped the war on drugs, which disproportionately affected black Americans, despite the fact that black Americans don't commit drug crimes more than anybody else. So he has a lot to answer for there, but he's not going to be held to account for it. The left wants to beat Trump. So if pictures show up of Joe Biden wearing blackface and a Klan hood, they're still going to support him.
Okay. I think you've made your point in as stark a term as possible. Now, I want to go back to something that you said, which we've discussed before, which is that in describing themselves, a majority of black people call themselves conservative, and yet they vote in numbers usually over 90% for the Democratic presidential candidate.
Over the past 60 years, the Republican Party has not made a concerted effort to reach black voters. Now, Trump is starting to do that. But here's the thing. Throughout the history, since the Republican Party was formed, there has been a bit of a back and forth. And when when black people started voting more Democrat, when Eisenhower took over, he was convinced to do at least some outreach to the black community. And when he did that, and when his campaign team did that, they almost doubled the amount of black support that they had received previously when Eisenhower was first elected.
Now, as you've said, President Trump has made really an unprecedented effort for a Republican to reach black voters, or the biggest effort since the 1950s. How much of a difference do you see this making in the black vote, which Trump got 8% of in 2016?
Yeah, those are all factors that will work in his favor. I think the COVID-19 situation might put a little hurt on that. But I think overall, just the fact that he's even trying, I think that's going to get him more than what he had before. I'm not sure how much of an increase that'll be, but I think he has a good chance of getting over 10%. And a lot of that, too, is because Joe's voter enthusiasm is in the toilet. Like, people who support him aren't very excited about it, whereas with Trump, people are more excited.
Well, I wrote a piece last week on LibertyNation.com about that enthusiasm gap, 18-point difference between Democrats excited about this election and Republicans, and that's 18 points in Trump's favor. Jeff, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.